This video is going to get you up and running with a series of R classes that I've created, tutorials that are on this website. You should have already run the setting up for R classes from that video, and you should now have a series of folders on your computer: R cleaning data, R getting started, R markdown, R tidyverse part 1, part 2, and using tidy census. And it should have also unzipped a bunch of files in each directory. So we're going to be working in the Getting Started directory. If you followed through that last video, you might have created a project already with that, and you'd see a file in here with a .proj. If you have that, go ahead and double click that and it will launch in RStudio, and then sit back and wait for the rest of us to catch up with you. If you do not, like I do not, then you want to go into open up RStudio, and you will go to the File menu and choose New Project. There's a couple different ways to open files in R. I'm recommending that you create a new project every time you are going to work on a group of things. So for example, I have a census project that I use for any time I want to go get 1-year ACS data, and I have a different one for 5-year ACS data. And I have ones that go with specific story projects I'm working on. I have like 5 different education ones for things that I use on a regular basis, like test scores or something like that. But think of it as a directory where you'd have anytime you have things that you want to put together. So we're going to use existing directory and go find that R Getting Started directory and choose that. Say open, and it should be in here. Say create project, and it's going to create that project and automatically open it for you. So now you get up in the upper right corner, you should see R Getting Started. And those of you who launched your project that was already created, you should have the same screen. Up in the upper right, it says R Getting Started. Down in the lower left, on the Files tab down here, you should see those files that were unzipped that I gave you, and they're all here. So you can see that we have a file that ends with .r, and we have another file that ends with .rmd, and then we have a .txt file, which is a data file. I'm doing a little bit of bad file organization here, and I put our data file right in the root directory. You'll see in the future sessions that I'm recommending that you put it in a folder named data. You keep it separate from your other files. The .r file is a script file. The .rmd is a markdown file, and we're going to work through each one. So go ahead and click on the .r file. So getting started with rscript.r, and it will open up here in the top. And so it should tell you all these things that you've already done. We'll look around RStudio here a little bit. Right here we're in the script editor area, and this is primarily where you'll be working. Down in the bottom is what's called the console, and you'll see as we type code it's going to run down here. You'll see that in a minute. Up in the upper right is the environment, history, connections. Environment is the main one you'll be using, and this is where when we create some data frames, it will be, think of that as tables, they will be over here. And then down in the bottom, the files section is the main one, and it's showing you what your working directory is, and that's where R is pointing to. So if you want to get something or you want to output something from R, unless you specify something different, this is where it's going to go. And it's always good to have a working directory set. If we do some plots, some charts or something, sometimes they will show up here. Packages is going to show you which R packages are installed and ready to run for this. And you can also run updates in here if your packages have gotten a little out of date. Mine probably have. Maybe I'll do that later today. And so those are the main places where you're going to be looking. The file menus up here have a few things, but mostly you're able you should be able to do most of your work right here within these 4 panes. And then at the top of the script editor is a run button that we'll be using quite a bit today. There's different kinds of R files that, like the one we have open is a script. And so what happens is you can run all your code in here and save your code, but the results will not be displayed right within your code. It'll actually be displayed down in the terminal, and you'll see that this is not ideal for some of the analysis we do. I find that scripts are really good if I have, let's say I have to import a data file and there's a ton of data cleanup that needs to be done on the import. A script works really good for that, and then I can have a markdown file, which a markdown file or a notebook allows you to have code and have the results show up right in line with the code, and you can make it look pretty and actually turn those into HTML pages that you could share then with other reporters or editors. We're going to see that in a minute. So, but a script file is a nice kind of easy way to ease you into this. So every time you run something in R, you have to load any of the packages or libraries that you want to use. In the previous session, we installed packages, and installing them is something you just do one time, or if you get a new computer, or if you need to if you completely reinstall R or something like that on your computer. But generally you shouldn't have to do that very often. But this loading libraries has to be done with every script, every markdown page, everything that you're going to do. So in this one we're going to use just some of the packages from Tidyverse, and so that's the only libraries we need to load. And Tidyverse is actually a series of packages, but this little bit of code here will load them all for us. So there's a couple different ways to run code. There's some keyboard shortcuts if you want, but for visual purposes I'm going to show you here. We'll highlight this and go up to the run button, and you'll see that it says run the current line or selection. And what's going to happen is it's going to show some stuff down here in the console. It's saying that it's loading Tidyverse, and it attached these packages: ggplot2, tibble, tidyr, readr, per, dplyr, stringr, and forcats. We're going to use a lot of dplyr today and a little bit of readr, and maybe a little ggplot. So you can find out more about any package by putting a question mark in front of the name of the package and run it, and it'll show up over here in your help window. And this is a web page, so you could click it and open it up in a web browser if you want, but it will give you a lot of details and useful links to how to use things and things like that. So the Tidyverse, here's some packages we'll be using. readr is for importing text files. dplyr is general analysis. It's basic, in my mind, it's SQL, but you know, in a different version for R, and slightly better in my opinion than SQL. ggplot2 is for making charts. tidyr is for cleaning data, and readxl is for importing Excel files. This is a getwd is a basic R command that allows you to see what your working directory is. So if I run that down here in the console, it tells me that my working directory is that R getting started file, which is where we want it to be. Sometimes if things are acting buggy and you're having trouble importing a file or something, sometimes it's worth checking your working directory and make sure something didn't go south on you. There's different ways you can set some permanent default directories. I'll let you read about that. We're going to work with the baby names data file from the Social Security Administration, and this is a file just for Massachusetts that I downloaded. It contains the number of Social Security applications, which is kind of a proxy for births, by state, gender, name, and year of birth. And so it has 5 columns, and I've kind of made a little record layout here for you. And we're going to bring it in, and we're going to work through a couple of problems with it. So let's talk about some basic syntax in R. This less than symbol minus sign is an assignment operator, and this is part of base R, and so it's used in everything in R, and you'll be using it regardless of what packages you're using. And so what this is doing is saying read CSV is a command from the readr package, and this is the arguments for read CSV, which is just telling it what file to bring in. We're going to add some more arguments in a minute, but for now we're telling it go get this file. And because we're not telling it where this file is stored, we're letting R assume it's in the working directory, which it is. It's right there, ma.txt. And so what this is saying is go get ma.txt and assign it to a new data frame that we're calling raw data. So this is a name that I made up. And if we run this, now we're going to have a file, a data, actually Tidyverse calls this a tibble. In base R it's called a data frame. And it's over here in our environment. If you click on it in the environment, you can actually pull it up like a table. And we have a bit of a problem here, is that the original file didn't have headers on it. And so R just guessed that the first row was headers. Well, obviously it's not. Mary is now the header, not data. They're leaving my name out. We got to fix that. Can't do that. So if you go down in the Files tab down here, you can open this file and take a look at it if you want. But one of the things you can do is we can add another argument to our read CSV and say there's no header there. The column's name is false. If we run this now, it's going to, because we use the same data frame name, it overwrote what we had before. And now if we open this up, you'll see that it has given it column names, just it always does x1, x2, x3. And that looks a little bit better, right? So the other thing is that Excel guesses, or R guesses the field types based on the first 1,000 rows. Let's look at this again. Do you see what it did here? There's a word false. Well, if we look back at our record layout, column 2 is the gender. So what happened is it saw the F for female, and it assumed that's a binary, true or false. And so when it got down to the boys, it left them blank, NA, null. So we need to tell R, nope, that column is a character. Don't mess with it. Leave the T and the R, the T and the F. And you can see in our down in the console that it hit parsing failures. And this is what happened, is that it didn't know what to do with the M's. And that's what this is saying. My biggest gripe with R is that the warnings and the error messages are not always super helpful. This one is not too bad. At least kind of tells you that there's something going on with this column. And you can see what happened here is that it set it to a logical, which is true false, instead of setting it to character like it did for these, like this is the name column, right? So we need to tell it to set that to character. So the way to do that is to, let's go down here, is to use this syntax. We're going to add another argument telling it set the call types. And in this case, we're just going to tell it set that x2 to call character. Leave the rest of them the way you had it before. Now if we run this again, we open our file. Oh, that looks better. And we did not get an error message down here in the console. Notice it ran it with no red. The red up here is from the last time we ran it. So that looks a lot better. Now we can also use str as a base R command that we can use to look at the structure, and it's going to spit it out down here in the, it's going to tell us that x1 is character, and it gives you some examples. Character number for the year, character for the name, x5 for the number for x5, which is the number of babies born that year. And then it also gives you this little specification. So you can check and see. So that process I just walked you through is a very common one that I go through for importing data, that you have to kind of test things out and bring things in and test it and see what you want to do. We're going to skip down, and you can one of the great things about R is that you can pipe together operations and have it do more than one thing at one time. And so I'm going to show you. So this little symbol here, the percent sign greater than percent sign, which you can do using Control-Shift-M, will get you on a Windows keyboard, will get you that pipe. And I highly recommend using the keyboard shortcut. So that pipe is part of tidyverse, and it's one of the greatest things about tidyverse is that you can pipe operations together. So what we're going to do here is we're going to do the import, and we're going to give it a new name this time, something a little more interesting, and then we're going to pipe in a little tidyverse that allows us to rename those columns to something that is a little bit better. We're going to say change x1 to state, to x2 to gender. Notice that it goes backwards from what you would expect, but it's there. So with the pipe, the thing is that it has to be, if you're indenting and putting your code on separate lines like I am here, that pipe has to be at the end of a line. It can never be at the beginning of a line. Now if we run this, now we have two data frames because we've brought in, we changed the name. So now look here, we've got nice headers, and we can get rid of that old data frame using RM or remove, and it gets rid of the raw data. We can look at the top of the baby names file, and I'll spit it out down here in the console, which is not all that different from when we clicked on it over here and opened it up here. We can, so dplyr, it's worth checking that out. Dplyr, like I said, is very much like SQL. It allows you to select which columns you want to look at, filter your data, group by your data, summarize it in various ways, and many more things. So the way dplyr works is you tell it what data frame or tibble to do its work on, and then you have a pipe. So think about the pipe as kind of the equivalent of and then. We're going to tell it select just these columns from the file. And when we run this, it shows up down in the, because we're in a script, it shows up in the console. You can see it's pulling out just those 4 columns, and it's giving us all the rows. It's not limiting which rows it gives us, but we can't see all the rows, and that's a limitation of the console. So, we didn't tell it to filter or restrict which rows were returned. And notice you can type the column names in whatever order you want, and it'll appear in that order. It doesn't have to be in the order that they are, and you can limit, what you want. Now we can. So that's select. That's one verb within dplyr. Another verb is filter. So we can tell it, let's just get the ones where the name is Mary. And notice that it says equal equal. That's a thing that you have to do to make it work. Whenever you're going to say look for a particular value, you say equal equal. And so now it's just giving us those rows where the name is Mary. And you can see it's a much smaller data set that it's returning. And then we piped, we continued piping and said, show me these columns. We can also make a new data frame. Notice that assignment operator. We can tell it, use the baby names table and filter it down just to the births in 2018 and make that its own data frame called baby names 2018. And so now you can see that there's 1,803 observations, a much smaller table than our previous one, but we still have all the same columns because we didn't tell it to restrict which columns to use. It's all there. So that's getting that assignment operator in there. And this, what we just created here is just in R. It's living in the ether. There's no file sitting somewhere on your computer. If you wanted to make a file, you can use a write.csv code to export just that data frame, for example. We're not going to get into that right now. So that's given you a little idea, and you've kind of seen the limitations of a script. Let's move over here and open the Getting Started with R Markdown and quick show you what can be different over here. You'll see that there's a lot of different code in here. There's some pre-baked code that is needed in order for this to be a Markdown page, and that will come already loaded. Up at the top is what's called the Yamo Header, which you can tweak a little bit to your liking. I'll let you read more about that. And so, again, we need to, especially if you were starting from scratch, you would need to load your libraries. In this case, Tidyverse is already loaded because we were just working with it and we haven't closed R. But I'm going to load it again just to be safe. And then we're going to, we can import our data again. And you know what, actually, I'm going to back up. Let's just shut this stuff down and start over. I'm going to close my project and you'll kind of get an idea of how to start up again. So now I have a project, so I can just go to my projects and say R Getting Started, and it will open up my project, and you'll see that it automatically opened the script file because I still had it open. But I'm going to go open the markdown file, .rmd, and you'll see now we have no data frames up here, and our packages are not loaded. So we need to start by loading our packages. One of the big things that's different about R Markdown is how you run code. There's blocks of code. It has these I'm not sure what they're called, back dashes or something like that, or back quotes at the front and the end, and you'll see it's kind of grayed out. So this is a chunk of code. The white areas are Markdown, and it will show up on your web page as text. And by putting a £sign in front of this, it's going to turn that into like a header, like a bigger font. And this part is just going to show up as plain, like basic text. So what we're going to do is run this block of code that loads the libraries and imports the data. I've put it all in one block of code. Sometimes it's good to have each block of code do something different. In this case, I put it all in one. So there's a bunch of ways to run a block of code in R Markdown. Up here you'll see our Run button now has options. So we can say Run Current Chunk. Run all chunks below will run everything in your script. So don't do that just yet. But or you could do selected lines. So we could highlight the library ones and we could say Run Selected Lines, and it will just load the libraries for us. And you'll see that the console is still operating. Let me pull this up a little. It ran these down here, and you'll see things, but we don't need the console quite as much. You'll see that in a minute. The other thing you can do is say Run Current Chunk, and you can either do that from up here in the Run menu, or there's a little button on the top of the chunk. We can say Run Current Chunk. So what that just did is it reran the libraries, and then it imported baby names, did all that cleanup that we did before, and now we have a tibble or a data frame. So you can insert a new chunk of code by going to Insert and choose R. And you can see that there's all kinds of other things you can insert into a Markdown page. We're going to stick with R, and see now we have this little bit of code. So we can say, let's use the baby names table, and I'm going to select, like we did in the last one, I'm going to select name, gender, number, births. If I run this current chunk, it's going to give you a huge output, but it puts it all in, it paginates it into separate pages. We didn't tell it what order to put it in or anything like that, so it's putting it in the order that it is stored in the table. But you can see this is how the results of our query show up right below our syntax, which is great. And we can see all of it. It's not completely hidden like it is in the console. I'm going to skip through a little bit. We can, let's run this one. You can see I'm adding another verb on here, arrange, that will order the name. So this one is saying use the baby names table, filter it to 2008 and to just the boys, and then give me the name and the number of births. and then arrange it in descending order by that number of births column. And it shows us that Benjamin was the most popular name that year. And this kind of this is a pretty much a full dplyr query on just pulling something straight from your data. Notice down here, this is a really similar query, but notice that I've indented it. So what I did is I typed baby names and then the pipe, and then hit enter, and it automatically indented. Doing this makes for more readable code, and you won't have it running off your page if your window gets small. dplyr also allows you to summarize, and so for example here there's another verb called summarize, and you can spell it either with a Z or an S, the British way, and sometimes I find myself doing the British one. And so what we're saying is use the baby names, filter to 2008, and count up the number of births total, regardless of the name. Notice we're not asking for the name or anything like that. If we do this, we get that there's 52,635 babies in that year of that data set. But we could also say group by a gender. So this is like doing a pivot table in Excel or doing a group by query in SQL. We're telling it make our groups using the gender column and then summarize add all the values out of the numbers column. That's what sum is doing. So you can see it's pretty evenly split. A few more boys than girls that year, but not too bad. And we could also do things like, let's say we want to find just the babies named Mary. We want to group by the year and count how many babies there were each year named Mary. So let's do that. So back in 1910 there were 995. You can see that it goes up and it goes on to many pages and many pages because Mary's a very old name. But last year, in 2018, there were only 41. Surprisingly, the name is holding on pretty well. So that's a basic introduction to R Markdown. One of the other sessions is going to teach you how to make this look a little prettier in your output and how to turn it into HTML pages that you can share. In the meantime, this is a good way to be able to see your work as you go.